Lumion is one of the most popular rendering softwares for ArcViz artists, interior designers, architects and many more. And the reason being is that it's so easy to use, it's so quick, it's so intuitive, and particularly now with the inclusion of ray tracing, the results can be absolutely fantastic. In this ultimate starter guide, you're going to learn my top tips for getting really good results in no time. We'll run through everything, including gathering references, importing your model, texturing it up, rendering presets, and a few extra tips to really boost that level of realism. And we'll round it off with a cheeky bit of camera raw in Photoshop. For this video, a really good SketchUp model has been kindly donated by world-renowned architects, Strom. They are a specialist in high-end residential design, and I'm very proud to say that we're quite close to them now after a recent podcast episode with them. And in creating our complete guide to SketchUp, which is linked below, I asked them to give us any reference material that we could get from them for the famous Quest building. And in doing so, they added an extra SketchUp model, and it's that model that I've used today. Strom typically use a fantastic CGI company called Strive. So before I did anything, I went through their website and just picked up on their style and just generally absorbing how they approach visuals to just really give me that amazing reference point. With the reference and end goal in mind, I then proceeded to tidy the model up, knowing that I was going to replace a lot of the assets, particularly the vegetation within Lumion. So I went ahead, I deleted the trees, the grass, the couple of cars in the driveway, and generally just cleaned up the model ready for import into Lumion. And as part of that process, I also like to get rid of any textures within SketchUp. Unless I'm deliberately building textures up within SketchUp, I like to remove them and swap them for block colors. And the reason I do that is it makes it easy for me to identify where I need to make changes to materials, so I've got more control within Lumion. And one key thing to point out when it comes to model preparation, particularly if you're working on larger landscapes, is to duplicate the overall landscape down twice. So you end up with 3 layers of landscape effectively. And the reason you do that is it gives you the flexibility to create varying textures and the use of 3D grass within Lumion. The key to a really realistic landscape is variation, and that variation should be seen within the grass. And when you've got those 3 layers, typically then what you do with those 3 is the top layer is a simple texture. The one beneath is a 3D grass, and the one beneath that is another 3D grass. But between those 2 layers of grass, you will actually utilize the landscape tools within Lumion. And within those landscape tools, you can add scatter objects to just add that little bit more variation and realism. Your next step is to import the model, and Lumion can read pretty much any 3D file. So with the model imported, we lift it up a little bit so it's not interfering with the ground plane. And then what I like to do is I like to use Lumion's in-house materials to just populate the model with materials that will closely or roughly reflect the materials that I'm picturing, and we'll get into more detailed materials later in the video. With the thing imported and the textures applied, I also then like to set my camera views, and I just add a 2-point perspective effect, so I've got the camera views nailed. And with those camera views set, we can then add detail according to those views. you'll have noticed at the start of the video and at the end, there's a few animated clips. Well, they largely depend on the positions of the still images as well. So once you've got those cameras set, you can really understand then what you're focusing on, and you can concentrate your energy in those areas. Earlier I mentioned that you wanted 3 layers of your main landscape, and you can see here how we've utilized those 3 layers. So the top layer is the material, just a basic texture, and then beneath that we've got 2 sets of 3D grass. I like to use wild grass because there's lots of variation in there, and then one of those layers is actually using the landscape texture. And then what you need to do is you need to come out of the material mode and go into the landscape settings, and then in there it will automatically make those adjustments to that layer of the landscape. So we want 3D grass turned on, and then we want to create numerous scattering objects, leaves, rocks, flowers, weeds and things like that. And that just really populates that landscape. And once you're taking exterior views and you're bringing that landscape into those views, you'd be amazed at how realistic it looks. With the cameras set and we've got a decent idea of the views that we'll be taking, you'll inevitably find flaws in those views. So what I then like to do is jump back into the model and make certain adjustments. In this instance, I wanted the kitchen cabinets to be a different material, so I could just give them a nice white gloss. I noticed that the stone wall just needed a little capping piece on it, and there's a few other bits that you can just kind of jump between Lumion and SketchUp. Personally, I'm actually not a fan of the live sync. I prefer to just jump between the two. It has a bit of a lower load on your machine as well. Other things I spotted included like the rug as well. I didn't want the rug to be the same material as the furniture. So just a few little tweaks, few little refinements, and again that's where the use of block colours comes in really handy, because it's very clear how you distinguish between them. For the water, I had to use a bit of a workaround, because what I found was that there was a bit of a bug when you're rendering using the ray tracing and you're rendering water through glass. So we've got these lovely big windows that look out to sea, and what I was finding was there was just a bit of a bug when you were trying to view the water through the glass. So what I've done is I've downloaded a water normal map to just give the surface a bit of variation that looks like water, and just played with the reflectivity settings and the colouring just to get it spot on. And from the distance we'll be viewing that water, that's more than convincing. So then it's actually a solid object with the relief of water and the reflectivity of water. So that just renders spot on then through the ray traced glass. Then onto my favourite part of any CGI project, and it's adding assets. So we start with a couple of cars. Say we've deleted those from the original model. We just put a couple of higher end cars in to suit the level of the design. And then we move into adding vegetation, and there's 3 layers really that you want to consider when you're doing your vegetation. You've got your real backdrop vegetation, which you just use Lumion's clusters. Close up, they're pretty awful, but in the backdrop, they're more than convincing. Then you use regular trees. Keep an eye out for those that take the ray tracing elements of Lumion. We've just got a little RT next to the title. You populate then the surroundings of your scene with those trees. You then move into detailed trees, and be careful with the placement of those because they're quite heavy. But then as you get closer to the camera, I like to then populate a decent amount of those detailed trees. They're the trees and the bit of vegetation that are going to be closer to the camera. So that will just add to the realism, as the eye, when it looks at those, will be immediately convinced. I then like to fill the kind of the undergrowth of trees, so you hide the horizon with various plants. And then those plants that are getting closer to the camera, again, I will use more detailed, or the fine detailed plants. Now, there's been some decent upgrades to the scatter tools within Lumion, and one particular one I like is the cluster placement. You can add several objects to a cluster, then increase the number of items and the variation amongst those items, and then you can kind of dot them about. The variation in that placement really adds to the level of realism. And while we're here, we should also touch on the use of layers. For this video, I'll just demonstrate using vegetation, but you should use layers across the board. And what you can do is you can actually utilize quite a lesser known tool, which is Lumion's selection tools. You can click on one object and then hit select all and then assign that to the appropriate layer. And while we're on selection tools, once everything is selected with those tools, you can then vary things like rotation, position and scale and things like that. So once you've scattered all your objects, make sure that you're using the selection tools to put them on the right layer initially, and then to vary their position, rotation and scale, adding again to that level of realism. Next, we move into Megascans, an absolutely brilliant library of just realistic scanned textures and 3D assets. For me, it is second to none. So make sure that you're never doing a CGI project again without the use of Megascans. In order to utilize Megascans, you need to install something called Quixel Bridge. Once that's installed and open, you can then scan through the vast library of what they call surfaces and 3D assets. And in this instance, or for this project, I wanted to really improve the concrete in particular. We do go on to use Megascans for other materials, but the main objective was the overriding concrete. I wanted more variation in its texturing, its kind of relief and imperfections, and a bit of variation in reflection. Now, in order to use Megascans with Lumion, you need to change the export to just like a download type export on disk. So you change those settings, you create your download folder, and then it just downloads the materials as separate maps. And thankfully in recent years, Lumion now provides you with all those maps. It didn't used to. So with all those different maps downloaded, and by the way, in the export settings of Quixel Bridge, you can identify what maps you want to download. With those downloaded, you add those textures to the relevant slot. So albedo or diffuse is the main colour. You've then got normal for the relief. You have a roughness map for the roughness slot, but you can use a gloss map and invert that within Lumion. The relief is a normal map, if I've not mentioned that already. And then the reflectivity within Lumion, you use the specular map. And then it's always nice to just add a tiny bit of displacement where you can. And something that I mightn't have mentioned just yet is within Lumion there are different settings as well. So make sure that you're looking at things like weathering and soften edges. Make sure that you're always adding that little beveled edge to everything. Nothing in reality has a truly 90-degree angle. And while we're in Megascans, when I was cleaning up the original model, there was like a rock or like a boulder just coming through the end of the pool. Now I want to replace that or kind of build over it with a Megascans asset. So I went ahead and downloaded a boulder, and then using similar settings for the export, you'll export it to a place on your computer, and you'll often bring it in as an FBX import. So you import that model separately, and it also comes complete with all the relevant textures, the color, the relief, the reflectivity, and so on. And it just knows, just because it's exported from the right sort of place and the textures are obviously spot on, it just knows how to map it correctly. So if you've got any objects like that where you want to boost the realism, I would encourage you to use the Megascans equivalent. So we've got that loaded in, and I think it looks absolutely fantastic. Now onto bespoke furniture assets. My preferred website is one called 3D Sky, and for me, over the years, it's always proved the most reliable. It's not free, it has free options on there, but generally speaking, it is a premium website. But I am a believer of, sometimes these things are worth investing in for the level of quality. So for this video, I've opted to just delete the sofa and the coffee table from the SketchUp model to showcase how we can bring in a really realistic piece of furniture. So we start with the corner sofa, and we do use Megascans fabric textures actually to apply a really nice white fabric to the sofa. And we then also download and bring in a coffee table. A pro tip when bringing in these sort of assets is that you may find errors with them. Some errors might be there's additional bits of geometry, and the intention of those, in this instance there was a ball. That ball is like a texture selector, so the intention is for it to be used in 3D Studio Max, and you would pick the texture from that ball and apply it to the object. But that doesn't work for us because that ball's loaded in. So I'm lucky enough to have a license for 3ds Max, so I just jumped into 3ds Max, deleted it, and then just exported it as an FBX. But I think it also works with Blender, which is a free tool. So if there's another file type, which there often is with 3D Sky, bring that other file type into Blender or something similar, and you can then edit the geometry there and then export it as ideally as an FBX. Another thing to mention is that within 3ds Max, some of this geometry will have been smoothed, often using a turbo smooth modifier. And if that modifier hasn't been collapsed, then it doesn't come through to Lumion. So you get like these horrible faceted edges. So again, jump into a modeling software such as 3ds Max or Blender and apply the smoothing, and make sure that the smoothing is fully applied, fully collapsed to that geometry, and then export it as an FBX again, and it loads in absolutely perfectly. And we're nearly there. Now we move into rendering and working with presets within Lumion. The presets out the box are pretty good. You can utilize a sunny day, you can utilize the overcast settings, but I really like to make my own stack. And you'll be glad to know that within the description below, you can download the finished Lumion file, and you can have a look at all the rendering stacks that I've created, and you can start to form your own presets on the back of that. Now, one key thing that I like to maintain, it's a bit of an old school trick, but I still think it's the most effective, is combining the sun with real skies. Because it just doesn't always give you the right sky and sun position in one hit, and historically you needed both to be able to mess with the sun intensity and the sky intensity. Now those options are now within real sky, but I just like that extra level of control. So that's included in my bespoke rendering stack, if you like, the preset stack. So then what I do is I go through each view, I start with the same preset, but then I make adjustments to those settings based on the view, because one preset doesn't serve, well, it barely serves two views. So every view always needs its own little bit of refinement. Another thing to mention as well is that the colour correction effect now in Lumion is excellent, and in there you can load what's called a LUT, and that is like an instant colour grading feature, and I quite like the tropical one that comes out of the box within Lumion, and I just reduce it to about 50% opacity, and it works an absolute treat. And what I like with Lumion is that you can save that preset off and load it into other projects, or you can just simply copy and paste that preset to all your views and then make those tweaks. Before we move into post-production, I like to change my ray tracing setting to just fast across the board and do a nice initial draft set of renders to just spot any final tweaks that need to be made, and I guarantee you there always will be. So do an initial pass of kind of low quality, low resolution visuals just to get a sense of what needs to be tweaked, make those adjustments, and then we're ready for final renders. And I like to set the preset within ray tracing to extreme, which actually still doesn't take a lot of time. It only took about 50 minutes for all the still images to render, so that's not too bad. Gone are the days of waiting overnight for visuals to render. Once you're happy with the adjustments you've made, set them all to extreme within ray tracing and set them off to render, and I'll see you in Photoshop. And then last but not least, we're in Photoshop, and sometimes my post-production process can be very fast indeed. It's a simple case of making a duplicate of your base render, just so we've got the raw render handy, and we then just do a nice simple camera raw filter. We adjust things like exposure, contrast, the light and dark of shadows and things like that. There's little things like you can boost the texture, which increases sharpness, mess with the dehaze, tiny little bit of color grading in terms of, like, you know, temperature and tint and things like that. Little bit of tweak with vibrance and saturation, and there we are. Then what I like to do is duplicate that layer, and from that layer I then go back into Camera Raw and use one of the cinematic presets, and again it varies depending on the view. Once you've picked your preset, because that's on its own layer, I use the opacity slider to adjust the strength. And more often than not, that's all you need for your post-production. There are way more complicated methods than that, but I find that if I'm in a little bit of a tight deadline, that's more than good enough. So I hope you enjoyed that video. I hope you learned something. A couple of things to touch on before I finish. Firstly, please like and subscribe. Liking the video, commenting on the video just boosts it up the old algorithm ranks. Another thing, and a very important thing to touch on, is that Lumion is free for students. So if you are a student watching this, get in touch with the guys at Lumion, and I will leave a link below, of course, and you can get a free license, full pro license, so very, very useful indeed. And if I may, a cheeky plug for Aukademia. Head over to aukademia.com to check out what we're about. We have 2 full courses on Lumion, so if you want to learn more about Lumion and really take your renders to the next level, I would encourage you to watch those courses. Courses are accessed via a paid membership, and the idea with that is that we're building one hell of a community. At the point of recording, we've now got 1,100 paying members, and that is just staggering to me. The forums are now a buzz. Comment on videos, tutor support, you know, we're really getting there now. And yeah, so if you want to learn more about Aukademia, head over to the website, have a look at all the other wonderful courses we have on offer. It's not just about architectural visualization. We do things like project management, architectural detailing, We've got designing in practice. That's always a big one. There's absolutely tons on there. So that is also linked below. Have a look. And finally, if you've got any queries, either leave it in the comments below or drop me an email directly at adam@arcademia.com.